Is this on? Can you hear me? Great. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first Global Briefing Series event of the semester, and we're so glad to see all of you here. I'm happy to have you here in the Wes Watkins Center, and I see so many familiar faces and some new faces. I wanted to say how much I appreciate all of our students for being here, all the global studies students and my faculty, as well as colleagues and friends from across campus, and folks from the community. Our State Senator Duggar is here, I believe. Thank you, sir, for coming. Yes, great. I also want to say hello, hola, to our friends in Mexico from UPAEP, UIC, and other institutions in Mexico. We're so glad to have you join us via the live stream. We want to know that you're here, and particularly the students, if you're seeking extra credit, you can scan the QR code. It'll take you to a form, and then we'll have a record of your attendance. And we'll also have your email so that we can send you other announcements about upcoming speaker events. Normally, standing here would be Dr. Randy Kluver, the Dean of the School of Global Studies and the Dean of OSU Global. However, he's in Southeast Asia this week, and so I get to do these honors in his place. I am thrilled that I had that great luck to be the one that gets to introduce Dr. Katherine Brown. She and I have known each other professionally for several years, and I like to say that she essentially practices in Washington, D.C., what I study in Stillwater. So it's always nice to connect with a practitioner over a subject that I've devoted much of my research and scholarship to. Basically, her work and my scholarship sit at the intersection of international relations, global communication, and geopolitics. Specifically, Dr. Katherine Brown is the president and CEO of Global Ties US, which is a Washington-based nonprofit organization that coordinates the largest and the oldest citizen diplomacy network in the United States. So I also know Katherine through her work with Tulsa Global Alliance. Some of you may be familiar with TGA, and Katherine works directly with that group in Tulsa. And I think she's going to talk a little more about that. So, Dr. Brown formerly held, prior to Global Ties US, held positions with the National Security Council at the White House, as a public diplomacy officer at the U.S. Embassy in Kabul, and as the executive director of the U.S. Advisory Commission on Public Diplomacy at the U.S. State Department. So somewhere between all those very important positions, she also had time to get her PhD, which from Columbia, correct? And she also teaches occasionally at GW, George Washington University in Washington. Georgetown. Oops, sorry. I like to mess up other institutions' academic brand just to kind of elevate my own. That was completely intentional. Tonight, Dr. Brown will be talking to us about today's public diplomacy imperative and why public diplomacy matters for U.S. national security, what that really means, and how we, meaning us in this room, can contribute. So we're going to hear about a topic that should empower us and motivate us to be more internationally engaged and remind us why public diplomacy is so important. Katherine is simply one of the experts on this subject and a very nice person to boot. So I'm very happy to welcome Katherine Brown. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Fullerton, and it's so lovely to be here. I'm going to walk around a little bit. I am double mic'd for our live streamers at home as well. And Ola, thank you for joining. And I also want to thank Dr. Randy Kluver, who is a man and academic who I've long admired, brilliant, and really, really sorry that I'm missing him right now. But really wonderful to see this center in motion and to see all the incredible work that you all do. So I know I'm speaking to a lot of people who already know about public diplomacy, who are inherently interested in global studies and studying global dynamics. And so I hope that we can have a robust discussion at the end. Would love to hear your thoughts. And here we go. And actually, before I start, how many of you have taken a class or participated in some kind of public diplomacy or exchange program? Fantastic.
You are exchange students.
I'm an exchange program, yeah.
Wonderful. Great. Okay, this is exciting. Okay. So as Dr. Fullerton said, what I'll be discussing is where public diplomacy fits within international relations, why public diplomacy matters, and what we all can contribute. Because I do really believe that public diplomacy is a body of scholarship, and it's an area for us to research and think about. It's also an area to practice, in official public diplomacy, but also there's a spirit and a value of it that we can carry in our lives. So even as you're moving forward into your careers, into your studies, there's a way to think about public diplomacy that's really about the everyday, and that's at the essence of what we do at Global Ties US with citizen diplomacy work. So my agenda here is that I'm going to start with frameworks, because as I'll discuss more, I was PhD and taught international political theory for a long time. So I think it's really important to ground us in frameworks. So I'm going to talk about IR theory, soft power, trust, and then go into public diplomacy, what the definitions of it, because there's a few, the toolkit, what we're talking about when we talk about public diplomacy, and then what we all can do. And that goes into global ties, but also these individual acts. And what I'm going to be talking most about, and I'm just going to say right up front, is that the key to all of this is listening. So this is a little bit about me. A few pictures to kind of show you where I'm coming from. A lot of what I'm going to talk about is the importance of identity and the importance of culture and worldviews that we already have. And so this is where I come from. The biggest picture there is my team at Global Ties US. That is on the stage of our national meeting. It's the focal point of our year. It's a big conference in Washington. We hope that many of you in this room will join us in March. And this team is one of the most mission-driven, smartest, collaborative group of people that I've ever had the privilege of working with. And they show up every day to try to move public diplomacy forward and try to make it accessible for all US citizens. So I'm privileged to work with them. Going kind of clockwise from there, that top picture is representative of my time at the State Department, which began as an intern and then went into serving at the US Embassy in Kabul, Afghanistan 20 years ago, helping to restart public diplomacy operations there. And then later in life, running this office called the Advisory Commission on Public Diplomacy, which was set up by Congress to really tell Congress what's working in public diplomacy and what isn't working in public diplomacy, and essentially, explain it. What is this? What does this look like when you break it down by budget, when you break it down by activity, and what are we doing around the world to engage foreign audiences? So I had the privilege of doing that job, and then the other book image there is my book, Your Country, Our War, the Press and Diplomacy in Afghanistan, which is based on my PhD research about ways that our media travels and the media narratives, the frameworks, the biases that we have in the United States about our story and how that travels abroad, looking at the case study of Afghanistan between 2001 and 2013. And then that final picture is my family. I'm a mom, so that's my daughter, Abby, up there in the corner. And I bring this up because a lot of what I'm talking about the values of public diplomacy and the values of listening are things that are incredibly important to me personally, and making sure that Abby learns that as well. She just started at an international school. Maybe she'll come here one day. I'm looking forward to that. And then, sorry, full clockwise, because this is launching my presentation, is the Center for Security Studies that I teach at Georgetown. I've really shrunk my teaching schedule. I'm there about just for one 6-week session a year now. But really, a lot of what I'm going to talk about is based on my work with security studies students who are working in the Defense Department, working in the State Department, working in the intelligence community, working on the Hill, who aren't quite convinced that public diplomacy matters, that we should be thinking about public diplomacy as being a priority for foreign policy. So this is what I try to tell them when I start out, and I think I'm speaking to a receptive audience, but it's a very obvious point, very basic, but pretty critical, which is that the world is made up of humans. We are people. We live in a social system where relationships matter for national security, business and trade, and the overall advancement of human progress. So let's go. All right, frameworks. So why does international relations theory matter? I end up having this conversation with a lot of my practitioner friends, like, why should you be thinking about international relations theory? And it's mostly because it provides a framework to understand the world and to really create our worldviews. It provides a foundation to understand how countries, or states, as we refer to them as, interact and what drives them to act. So there's a lot of extraordinary smart people in the room. I'm not going to go through all of the theories because this is a very rudimental look at them. There's many different theories, but what I was always taught when I taught international political theory was to try to distill it down to these 3 pillars: realism, liberalism, and constructivism. And that you needed to look at the world with all of those lenses to have a complete picture of the world. And so I'm, again, not going to go into realism because I have learned that if I start talking about realism, 5 people are going to raise their hands and tell me I got it wrong. So what I'm going to focus on is constructivism. So it's really important when we're looking at foreign policy, and this is what I tell my students, that you look at it with a constructivist lens. So what does that mean? It means that states are primary actors. It means that the world is anarchic, that we don't have one supreme ruler in the world, but also that, in the immortal words of Alexander Wendt, that anarchy is what states make of it, that we construct our own reality, that the world is made up of humans and the world is also a social system, that norms and beliefs create our interests, and that idea matters, culture matters, identities matter, and relationships matter. So this is really the entry point within IR theory that we can start to talk about public diplomacy. And the essential frameworks that I go with are not just constructivism, but also soft power. It's a term that I think a lot of people in the national security community really actually find to be resonate more with them sometimes in public diplomacy. It's like, well, I don't really believe in public diplomacy, but I believe in soft power. I hear that a lot. So what is soft power? So definition by Joseph Nye is that it's affecting others through attraction rather than coercion. So it's about the role of ideas and culture and reputation in attracting international influence. And to unpack that a little bit more, what it's the framework that Joseph Nye gave us in the 1990s was really that a nation's soft power rests on our cultural resources, on our political values, and also on our foreign policies. So culture in places where it's attractive to others, like it can be high culture and it can be pop culture. Political values, when we live up to them at home, the values that a nation's projecting, you need to live up to them at home and abroad. And then the foreign policies, when they're seen as being legitimate and having moral authority. And what's really critical here is that one can undercut another. So credibility is everything, which is what Nye said, and I truly believe. So credibility is the quality of being trusted and believed in, and it's essential for a nation's soft power. So governments compete for credibility not only with other governments, but with a broad range of alternatives, including non-state actors, and that's the news media, that's corporations, civil society at home and abroad. But what's really important, and we talk about a lot in the class that I teach, is that audience matters too, right? Like for those of you who are US citizens, you might be thinking of like US soft power, right? But this is transferable also to many other countries. So what you might see as being soft power, another country having soft power, another country may not. And so we talk a lot about, okay, well, what's the soft power of China? What's the soft power of Russia? Why is that attractive to some countries? You know, and the US what we think is soft power maybe is not attractive. So it's all relative. We're all looking at the world through our own lenses and based on our identities and where we're from. So, but I want to dive a little bit more into here to trust, because trust is at the core of the Global Ties US mission, and I also think it's incredibly important for public diplomacy. So trust, this is a really great study from 2012 that the British Council did. Now, the British Council is essentially the public diplomacy arm of the British government, in addition to BBC. And they did this wonderful study about 10 years ago, and it's called Trust Pays. And I highly recommend it because they really articulated a lot of what I hadn't seen before. And I just want to highlight this quote, is that they're talking about how international relations trust is equated with the willingness to take risks on the behavior of others. And this relies on a familiarity with the behaviors, qualities, and values of another country. It also highlights the notion that trust is an ongoing and two-way relationship. And this is what's really critical for public diplomacy, because public diplomacy is meant to be two-way. It's meant to be a dialogue. It's meant to be a discourse. And what this reminded me of is I used to work for Condoleezza Rice when she was National Security Advisor, and she would always say, you know, it's really helpful to know your neighbor before you ask them for a cup of sugar. And it's that really kind of like basic human truth, right? That you should get to know one another and build trust before you ask them to take a risk on their behalf. And this is really important for our alliances. So no alliance can exist without trust. They just can't. And it's essential that there be these positive outcomes between states and non-state actors alike, because any partner in large efforts for diplomacy, business, and advocacy need to be seen as being credible to one another. And trust on a personal level and soft power in the relations between states are critical to making progress in the global challenges that affect us all. So what's affecting us all? We need allies. And I'm talking now as a US citizen. I'm going to talk about US foreign policy. Like, we need allies on some of and to build diverse coalitions on some of the major challenges of our time. We're talking about climate change, we're talking about pandemics, and also just democratic erosion that includes disinformation and the trust in democratic institutions, and war, conflict. And that includes like acts of terrorism. So how do we build trust? How do we share ideas? How do we construct new norms and establish shared values that strengthen our alliances? And this is where public diplomacy comes in. This is why this is so critical, especially in a very digital world that's still dealing with a lot of traditional great power political issues, politics, that we need to be thinking more about public diplomacy being at the center of diplomacy. So, public diplomacy, let's define it. There's lots of definitions. When I first met Dr. Kluver years ago at ISA in the International Studies Association conference, there was a couple of days of people just trying to come up with the canonical definition for public diplomacy. So never have. So here's three, right? And I rely a lot, as you see from Joseph Nye for this presentation, but also when I bring in Nicholas Call, because I know that you're using his book, Public Diplomacy, and he's a wonderful scholar that's made a huge contribution to this field. So here's three definitions, really overlapping. Nye talks about them as being tools used by governments to mobilize soft power resources to communicate with and attract the publics of other countries rather than merely governments. And I'm going to actually go down to US Department of State, because their definition is that they are efforts to expand and strengthen the relationships between the people of the United States and citizens of other countries, very broadly defined. And then you end up with Professor Call, And it's listening to the other side and working to develop a relationship of mutual understanding. So if you look at what does that mean, like the different activity pillars, I'm doing a side-by-side comparison of Joseph Nye and Nick Cole here. It's that Nye says it's daily communications, it's explaining decisions, it's strategic communications, it's developing campaigns to advance a policy, and it's exchanges, it's developing long-term relationships. When you go over to Nick Cole, he builds that out a little bit more. And it's news. He defines public affairs more as news, but also brings in international broadcasting, which is a huge component of U.S. public diplomacy that I don't talk a lot about today, but it's a huge component of it, U.S. Agency for Global Media Work. Advocacy, which is really about strategic communications, is trying to promote an idea, is trying to promote a policy. Exchanges and cultural diplomacy, and that's long-term relationship building, but that's really about sending citizens abroad. It's about having, finding ways to respect cultural heritage and celebrate another nation's culture. And it's also about international education. A lot of you who are in the room today, who are visiting, and this is the most key part. It's about listening. Right? It's the essence of the work is really about listening. This is what makes public diplomacy different from propaganda. It's about talking and really absorbing what you're hearing, and it's about listening to the audience before you start building out strategies and tactics for campaigns and for program design. It's really trying to get to know the audience and think about how you can connect with them. So this is what this looks like at the State Department, because I did give the State Department's definition. So bureaucratically, at the State Department, there's a lot of history here, too much to pack into a 40-minute presentation, but the State Department used to have its own agency. How many have heard of the U.S. Information Agency before? Yeah, USIA. So USIA existed from 1953 to 1998. It was seen kind of by the 90s as being a relic of the Cold War and really only served a purpose to push back against the Soviet Union, but also to fight back against communist ideology. And in the 1990s, a lot of effort to kind of downsize government. They moved a lot of the assets from USIA into the State Department and built out something called the Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs cone. So this is the office of this is the Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs organizational chart. So at the top, we have the Undersecretary. It's one of 5 undersecretaries at the State Department. They have political, economic, management, consular, which is taking care of American citizens abroad, and then Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs. Liz Allen, she's fantastic, was finally confirmed. And within that, the structure, you have essentially 4 functional units, and then you have 2 offices that, and by functional it means they're doing programs and activities. And then you have 2 offices that are kind of looking after everything. So I tried to translate what this all means by sprouting out and giving some explanation here. But at the very top in the front office, what they try to do is coordinate public diplomacy activities with the U.S. foreign policy efforts and try to make sure that those who are creating policies around the world are listening to public diplomacy realities and audience realities before making those policies. Then you have over to the right, the Expo Unit. Expo Unit is essentially the World's Fairs. The next World's Expo is going to be in Osaka in 2025. And we want to make sure that we have a USA Pavilion there because we almost didn't in Dubai, and it's a long story. I can tell you after you have questions. The down kind of going over to the left, the Office of Policy and Planning Resources, they try to make grand strategy a reality. They're looking at all the bureaucracy and the funding around public diplomacy. Going to the right, the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs, that's exchange programs, cultural heritage, American spaces, international education support, J1 visa, that's private sector exchange, that's au pairs, summer work travel. And then moving over to the right, you have Bureau of Global Public Affairs, that's media engagement and information campaigns. Then you have the Global Engagement Center, and that's countering state-sponsored disinformation or countering violent extremism. So that's what Public Diplomacy Toolkit, at a very broad level, looks at the State Department. But what I want to get to is that I love this from the Canadians. This is a pyramid of what public diplomacy looks like in Canada from their Foreign Affairs Ministry. And I love this because at the very bottom, the foundation is relationship building. And I believe really strongly in this. I believe that the information work in public diplomacy is very important, but you're not really going to have a receptive ear. People really aren't going to listen unless you have that relationship first and you build that trust. So I love it that the Canadians put that there as the foundation, as the most long-term dimension of public diplomacy. So the toolkit is, public diplomacy is really a set of tools. It's to leverage a country's soft power or to try to repair it. And it's about information, culture, educational exchange. And each public diplomacy function plays a really important role in helping to create an attractive image of a country that can improve its prospects for obtaining its desired outcomes. But a government's success in this really depends on its credibility. Like it's public diplomacy isn't magic, right? If a policy is unpopular, if something does not, hasn't been developed considering public reaction, it's going to be really difficult to convince people of otherwise. But this is where we're kind of building into the value of exchange programs. So, the trust that's generated by face-to-face interactions is really important. There's neuroscience behind face-to-face interaction. Virtual is a wonderful addition and enhancement of international exchanges, but we feel really strongly that in person, what we're doing right now is really critical. It has a stickiness to it. And to build trust, especially between leaders who are going to guide their countries and societies, is critical. So usually, though, if you're going to build that trust, it starts with an experience. And that's what an exchange program is. It's an experience. And they provide an opportunity for discovery, dialogue, and learning. And it feels authentic, it feels personal, and it feels just very real and authentic. So there are more than 80 exchange programs, and excuse me, but I'm talking about the US government-sponsored exchange programs. There's lots more in the private sector, as we know, and of course, there's many all around the world that are sponsored by countries. But within the United States, more than 1 million people have participated in them in the last 80-something years. And there are more than 230,000 citizens, so nearly 250,000 citizens, US citizens, have participated. And this is the federally funded programs. There's also hundreds of thousands, if not more than 1 million, of citizens who've come through in international education opportunities, like many of you who are here today, or as an au pair, or working at an amusement park for a summer. There's a lot of different exchanges there. And the alumni for the US government-sponsored exchange programs are pretty remarkable. There's 42 current members of the US Congress. We're relying on them right now to make sure this government doesn't shut down. There's 656 current or former heads of state and government, and there are 86 Nobel Prize winners. And so a lot of them came through this program. How many of you have heard of the International Visitor Leadership Program before? Me. Yes. How many of you have heard of Fulbright? Okay. Yes. All right. The International Visitor Leadership Program is older than Fulbright. It is the original foundational professional exchange program. It was created in 1940, essentially as part of the Good Neighbor policy, which was created during the FDR administration to be able to build relationships within the Western Hemisphere, but for it to be a community-based experience. And I think there was this enduringly brilliant idea that if we wanted to build relationships with influencers, that sure, bring them to Washington, but get them out of there as soon as possible. That the strength, one of the greatest soft power assets of the United States are our people and our community institutions, our cities, our educational institutions. So So let's showcase our cities, our people, our communities. And that's why the International Visitor Leadership Program was created, and it has endured. So today it's the best diplomatic tool we have. One of the reasons why I wanted this job was when I ran that office, the Advisory Commission on Public Diplomacy, I would visit our embassies overseas, and I would talk to our ambassadors and say, tell me what to tell Congress. Like, what are the most important programs for you to maintain? And hands down, it didn't matter if I was in Brazil or Mongolia, Indonesia, or Moldova, it was always the same answer, which was, please maintain the International Visitor Leadership Program. It's absolutely critical. So it's one of the best diplomatic tools that we have. But the magic of it, though, as well, isn't just the opportunity for international leaders to get a different view of the United States. It's an opportunity for US citizens to get a different view of the world, to humanize international relations. And that's really why I love my job so much. So I'll come back to that in a minute. But we could be doing a lot more of this work. There's a scholar who I don't have up here on the slide named Bruce Gregory from GW, who's been making this case for years that maybe we shouldn't call it public diplomacy anymore. It's diplomacy. We're working in an environment that is highly digitized, and that the public is the center, right? And so we need to be bringing these programs and these policies more into the focal point of our diplomatic work. Yet it is extraordinarily underfunded. That looks like a lot of money, I know, 960.7 million. It's tiny. It's tiny, 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 tiny. The international affairs budget is 4% of the federal budget. The international affairs budget includes our diplomatic funding, our development funding. And then within that budget, our public diplomacy budget is 1%. And so we are not dedicating nearly as much resources as we could be to make it front and center into diplomacy. And the other challenge is that this is what we're dealing with this week, is that even though this is really small, it's always on the chopping block. There's always a threat to more and more cuts for it. And so given that reality, some of the greatest advocates for this work, for public diplomacy, are our defense colleagues. Because essentially the State Department is the Department of Offense, right? It's doing a lot of the work to make sure that conflict doesn't break out and that our Defense Department does not need to activate overseas. And so Bob Gates is one of the greatest, former Secretary of Defense Bob Gates is one of the greatest advocates for work and in this work. And he embraced a term that Professor Nick Cole introduced called reputational security. Because we're always trying to figure out what framework, what words are going to make national security funders, appropriators to take this more seriously. And so what's been happening is that they've started to define this in terms of China and great power competition more recently. And so what Secretary Gates said in the Gates Center report, William and Mary, was that if we're able to avoid a military confrontation with China, then this contest that we're in will be waged as much of the Cold War was with non-military instruments of power. So we're kind of back in this Cold War mentality again in Washington. And so folks are trying to advocate for public diplomacy kind of within this framework again. And as one point is that Gates makes in this report is that China's outspending the US ×7 on foreign public engagement work, as much as we know about that. So what do we do about all this? This might seem like a abstract concern, but we have a lot that's within our power. So at Global Ties US, our mission is powering individuals, communities, and nations to build trust and advance peace and prosperity through international exchange. No one's going to comment on the photo? We have a photo contest every year. This one.
International audiences love Halloween.
Yes. Yeah. I think that was in Utah. I don't remember there. Yeah. Anyway. So that was an IVLP delegation. So we believe, kind of coming full circle, we believe that the world is made up of humans. that international relations is based on relationships, and that trust is the bedrock of all healthy, good relationships. And as the world has become more connected and more complicated, publics can affect the outcomes of diplomacy and commerce. And each actor has a worldview depending on where they're standing. And if one's going to deconstruct and transform that worldview or be open to other perspectives, they usually need to experience it and come into contact with it. So this is our nationwide network. We are in more than 80 communities across the United States, back to that genius idea in 1940. This is essentially what's evolved since then in the last 83 years. You can see we have a lot of presence in some states and not so much in others. That's something we're working on right now. But we're really proud to work with our partners in Tulsa and also in Oklahoma City here. And we're very proud to have Dr. Fullerton as a board member of Tulsa Global Alliance. So the impact, I talked a little bit about why I love this job, and it's not just the impact it has on building alliances abroad, but the impact it has here at home. And it's that we welcome, usually the pandemic's been a little screwy with us, but we welcome more than 5,000 international exchange participants to US communities every year, virtually and in person. We're doing a lot of our work virtually with professionals in countries where we can't easily get them to the United States, like Yemen and Syria, and right now China. But most of the work is in person. We also are very proud of the federal investment and the return on investment that the federal dollars brings to our communities. It's a 10-to-1 investment. That tiny, tiny budget actually positively economically impacts our communities. More than 90% of the educational and cultural exchange budget that is met for public diplomacy is actually spent in the United States. And so it has incredible return on investment. And we engage more than 34,000 volunteers and in more than 410,000 hours of community service. So that social impact is really, really important to us. And we've been spending years trying to figure out, how can we quantify that impact? How do we know, we know the warm feeling we get from this work. We believe in it. But how can we demonstrate back to funders and to stakeholders why this matters for our communities beyond the economic impact? So we worked with the USC Center on Public Diplomacy to develop a methodology that we could bring the scale nationwide and that could produce some meaningful results. And what we found in our first ever study, which just was launched, is that really this exchange work humanizes global affairs. More than 80% of survey respondents reported increases in global cultural competence. So what we're talking about are the people that don't do this work full time, but the people that meet with these international visitors and exchange participants, the ones that bring them into their offices, and the people who bring them into their homes. What do they get out of it? They increase their global cultural competence. It also encourages their local civic engagement. So it piques their curiosity about what more they can do to be more inclusive within their own communities. And so it actually helps to increase community integration. And it provides US communities with opportunities for economic growth and workforce development. So more than 80% of respondents agreed that exchange programs enhance the image of their community. Usually people, when they're asked to present about their area of expertise or something about their city, there's a great dimension of civic pride, right? And also there's an awesome opportunity for people to sharpen their presentation skills and to make contacts. And that's what leads to the last point here, which is that more than 30% have reported that they've stayed in touch with international exchange participants, which is really impressive because what we're talking about aren't exchange participants who stay in their homes where you actually build long-term relationships, but these are professionals that kind of come through and have an exchange of ideas, maybe for an hour or 90 minutes, and then move on. And so it really does help build international connectivity within cities. And something that the State Department's been very focused on is increasing city and state diplomacy to make sure that our cities are more represented on the global stage. And so this is very helpful with that effort. So You all are citizen diplomats, and a lot of you, I'm speaking to the choir here, and I know that you all know this, or else you wouldn't be in this room right now. But we want to make sure that I want to make sure that you're thinking about all the various different touch points and ways that you can engage and be public diplomats, be citizen diplomats. And the definition of citizen diplomacy is that citizens have the right and the responsibility to participate in and shape foreign policy. So when you engage civically within the United States, and for those of you who are US citizens and live here, you have this opportunity to really think about, become more informed about international affairs as well, and to talk to your members of Congress about why the United States should engage more and why that's in our economic interest and our national security interest. So, but the first thing is to really, and this is more kind of going back to my teaching security studies students, was just to really look at the world with this constructivist lens. That's really critical. To go abroad, to travel, to study, to take part in an exchange program. If you have any questions about the exchange programs that the State Department offers, please come talk to me. They're multi-generational programs. There's a lot of them for international citizens and US citizens, and you should take advantage. We can get up, about at 250,000 US citizens using these programs. We definitely want to increase that. And support your city's local global engagement. They're Global Ties US member. So I have the Tulsa Global Alliance here. They're doing fantastic work. They work on IVLP. They're also part of Sister Cities. What don't they do? They're working on the Young Southeast Asian Leaders Initiative. Iraqi high school students. And they always need people to come meet and interact with those participants. And these are some really extraordinary people that are coming to Oklahoma. So definitely there's opportunities there to engage. And bonus points, if you're inclined, especially this week, to talk to members of Congress about why this work matters, and if you're a constituent and you can share why you think this is important, please do so. I think there's a lot, we think that the Global Ties Network is so extraordinary because it's the constituency for the international affairs budget, and that it shows the impact of foreign policy here at home. But we really want to make sure that more and more members of Congress hear from their communities about why engaging globally matters and why it's important for US cities. So especially right now, because it's been a doozy of a week with Capitol Hill. But the most important thing we can do is really to create space to listen. That is critical. And that's what I mean by bringing the spirit of the public diplomacy work in all of your careers. Even if you're going into a defense career, you're going into business, you're going into some kind of work with civil society or education, listening is just really critical. And we're really proud that what this work means too for the United States is that we're listening to one another more within our communities when we do this work. And so the essence of public diplomacy is listening. It builds trust, critical for international alliances and our communities at home. It establishes authenticity and credibility, and it allows for the sharing of ideas and the creation of norms. And so it's on all of us to do this. And thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Catherine.
I got some water.
Enjoyed it. Yeah, get a drink.
Thank you.
Water. Make sure I have this turned on. Can you hear me? Okay. I know you guys can hear me because I talk really loud. But I want to make sure the people in Mexico can hear me. Right? Thank you, Catherine, so
Yes.
much. So we were supposed to have public diplomacy class tonight, and you gave my lecture even better, much, much better than I would have done. So we have a few minutes left. If we have any questions, oh, my students have their hands up first, so let's do Jeremy.
Dr. Brown, thank you so much for the presentation. It was a wonderful experience. My name is Jeremy Hicks. My credentials consist of a Boren Scholar, a Gilman Scholar, and Department of State Drill Sergeant. I'm kind of curious on the State Department's interaction or collaboration with the Department of Defense, and if you could provide some guidance on how I can get my troops more involved with focusing on international relations.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Jeremy, is that? Okay, great. Wow, where to begin? So we're gonna need to talk more offline because I got a lot of ideas. But where my head is going is I spent a lot of my career not in Afghanistan and working with our military, and especially during the counterinsurgency years, where I felt like our troops were asked to be everything to everybody, right? And to build trust as social workers and educators and public diplomats and everything. So I really saw this incredible heart and the spirit that I'm talking about with our troops. And I think, the one thing that can happen really easily is that there's just like an interagency breakdown when it comes to talking about what public diplomacy is. Like there's different definitions and terms, like the military will call it strategic communications or reputational security or such. And essentially we're talking about the whole thing, So I think it's really, the same thing. So I think it's really about, twofold, is that if there's ever an opportunity to work at like the embassy level, the interagency, to be open to learning about the different activities, but also to really push your State Department colleagues to listen as well. I know kind of the natural place where that comes to a head is around military information support operations, or MISO. I don't know if that's still the term that's being used. And I know there's a lot of lessons that are being digested by the post 9/11 wars and with Iraq and Afghanistan and the global war on terrorism about where did we get things wrong, because that's where a lot of public diplomacy work came head to head with military operations, and where there could have been probably a lot more collaboration, but there wasn't really that trust there. And so I think that gets to kind of what you can say is to really listen and build trust kind of within the different agencies. But I think some of our most effective public diplomats are members of our military.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Who else? Campbell?
Hi, my name's. Can you hear me? I don't know if it's going through or not.
It's not.
Oh yeah, third mic. Hi. So I'm Campbell Clark. Thank you so much for coming. So I was curious. I really like how you talked about building trust. I think that's a very important thing. So I was hoping you could elaborate somewhat on sort of the existing distrust in the world, and ultimately what has been done. And I don't know if you have any personal accounts or some stories that you could share as far as building trust. I'd love to hear it.
Oh boy, distrust in the world, where to begin? Well, so I think what's really important about trust building and credibility is the reason why I like Joseph Nye's framework is that he's trying to point out that there's three different pillars, right? There's the cultural pillar of soft power, there's the political values pillar, and there's foreign policy. And that, if, especially for culture is kind of somewhat easy, right? That's organic, and that is usually, developed, with not thinking about, oh, this is a soft power activity. But for political values and foreign policy, that I think distrust can easily happen when a foreign policy doesn't seem to have moral authority, or political values, especially around like democracy, that are being projected overseas don't seem to be lived up to at home. So I think we have, I've probably the biggest example, not to go back to Afghanistan again, but it's, keep repeating that, but it's a lot of my lived experience we had a lot of trust, in Afghanistan until the foreign policy decisions were made to end engagement there the way that it happened. And so, that is a lot of trust that was built by our troops, by our State Department diplomats, by our development workers, working to really build key relationships that, now we're trying so hard to salvage kind of more on an individual level. And I'm so grateful for all the work that Dr. Kluver and Dr. Fullerton and OSU has done to bring in Afghan refugees and to give them a home here. So I think that's my story. Like that was, something that was so gutting to see because there was so much work done to build trust and credibility, and then that seemed to disappear in an instant. But I think that all of this work that we do around the world is so cyclical, right? And that this is why constructivism is so important, because we're constantly constructing and deconstructing and reinventing what relationships mean. And I think that there's a lot of trust that needs to be built. You name it, name the bilateral relationship, but there's probably an example there. And it's just very, very important that when we look at states and we look at them with a constructivist lens, that we're not just thinking of the state as being an adversary or an ally, or assuming that the agenda that we have and that we want to talk about should be the top of the agenda, because usually they're bringing to the table a lived experience and a history and a culture that we may not even be thinking about, when trying to repair a relationship. So I don't know how to answer this question in a succinct way. We can talk more offline. But I think that, there's a lot of distrust, and we get it wrong a lot, U.S. foreign policy. But it's really critical that we keep listening. That we keep talking to try to build and repair and renew.
I think part of that has to do with media and the
Yeah.
disinformation
Yes.
space. And you didn't spend a whole lot of time on that, but that's because you work on the people to people, but there's a whole lot going on in the mediated public diplomacy that is, wide-reaching,
Yeah.
but not as trustworthy.
Yes, and that's actually what my research is more about, is the mediated public diplomacy space. So the narratives that we share and the narratives that we build and how those travel abroad, but also the intentional disinformation narratives and how that can be received. So if you don't trust the messenger, right, then you're more susceptible. If you don't trust the messenger, then you'll reject the information. And that's why it's really important, again, trust that around the mediated space.
Got time for one or two more questions. Yes, ma'am. Please introduce yourself.
My name is Becky Newby, and I'm a citizen of Stillwater. Maybe a citizen of the world. How's that? I have been studying humor, and one thing, just becoming a humor therapist.
That's great.
And one thing that they have really made a big point of is that if you start out with an introduction and you make someone laugh, that little bit of laughter can bring of trust.
Yeah.
And I hadn't heard that before. But we all have relationships on different levels. And this is very serious, what you're talking about. But I think sometimes the humor in life is what really, really connects you.
I love that. Yeah, absolutely. That's
And we
great.
take ourselves, or you guys, not me, I'm not part of this, but take yourself so seriously at the State Department. They're serious people, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Definitely.
What do you think about humor? Can we use humor in public Can we use humor in public diplomacy?
Oh, absolutely. I think that humor is also so deeply cultural, as well, and I think that it points to the need to become culturally fluent, in the countries where we're trying to connect with, so we can understand what humor is there. And it's also, the great kind of universal comedians forgetting his name, Charlie Chaplin. Yeah, Chaplin. Yes, and also the British Mr. What's his name? Mr. Bean. Yes, thank you. Anywhere I am in the world, you can turn that on, and that's universally on. And so how disarming that can be, right? And to kind of build trust and relax and be open. I think you're absolutely right. It's something you probably do a lot better, but I don't know if I would trust, this is being live streamed, I don't know if I can trust a lot of State Department colleagues to have a sense of humor that would create that environment, So, but a lot of them are very charming, so who knows?
Right. Anybody else? One more question. Anybody have something they want to ask? Oh,
Yeah.
who is that, Clinton? it up to you so we can hear you.
Yes, I'm Clinton. I'm in a global studies program. I want to know what's your greatest strength as a public diplomacy officer, and how has that kept you going all over the years?
What are my greatest strengths?
Yeah.
Oh,
So what's the secret sauce, Catherine? What keeps you going?
well, I really love what I do, and that's like the number one piece of advice is that someone told me when I was doing my PhD, like you have to really, really, really care more than anyone about the question you're asking because no one else is going to care what you're studying and doing, and that was pretty harsh, but I really do love what I do, and I think that's something that I'm extraordinarily lucky to have and have known since I was an exchange student in high school and realized how little I knew about the world and how much I wanted to know and just how humbling that was. But for strengths-wise, I mean, I think that one of my strengths is that I can be very, very focused, and so that is something that I think drives my husband nuts because I get into like tunnel vision and I'm in it. I get sucked into things really, really deeply. But usually, what I get into are people's stories, and I think maybe it's one of my strengths. I think it's something I continuously work on, but is empathy, and so that can make it also though really hard to be a national security professional because I want to listen to a variety of opinions. I want to think about it. I want to get in the conversation, and so that serves me well in some areas, but in others maybe it'd be nice if I could just like hurry up and make a decision and maybe not get sucked into so many other people's personal stories. But I hope that answers it. Yeah.
Catherine, thank you so much for being
Oh,
here.
thank you.
We got you a few little presents. in a good
Lovely.
bag, so thank you all. Thank you all for coming this evening. Our next Global Briefing Series speaker is Everett Eisenstadt. He is a Stillwater native, and he will be here on October, I'm looking at Bailey, 26th. Okay. So I hope to have all of you back. Bring a friend, and thank you again for joining us this evening. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you. All right.
I probably want to take a picture.
Okay. Thank you for the goodies.
You're gonna do it now. Oh yeah. They're just little things.